Ukraine is gaining ground. The country's armed forces recently celebrated the liberation of the village of Andriyivka in the Sumy Oblast, driving Russian troops out of the area. But they're not stopping there. Ukraine soldiers now plan to push on, with a fresh assault planned for the village of Yunakivka not far from the Russian border. Should this mission prove successful, it would represent another big win for Ukraine at a time of increasing Russian pressure in the Sumy area. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, even recently stated that he wouldn't rule out ordering his forces to attempt to capture Sumy city, the administrative center of the region. At the flagship economic forum in St. Petersburg, Putin said, "We have no objective to take Sumy, but in principle, I do not rule it out. They pose a constant threat to us, constantly shelling the border areas." At the same event, Putin also made multiple bold, bullish claims about the war, even at one point suggesting that all of Ukraine should belong to Russia. He said, "I consider Russians and Ukrainians to be one people. In that sense, all of Ukraine is ours. There is a saying, wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, that is ours." Ukraine strongly disagrees. Its forces have been tirelessly and remarkably defending every inch of their territory since the invasion began. And as their resolve has strengthened and Russia's war machine has weakened, the Ukrainians have started to turn the tide in key locations, launching counterattacks and regaining lost ground from the occupiers. A great example of this was seen recently in the village of Andriyivka. On the map, Andriyivka doesn't look particularly special or significant. It's a small settlement in the northeast part of Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. It's one of the many similar settlements dotted around the area, and yet it has been a major target for Putin and the Russian forces ever since their summer Sumy offensive began. This is primarily due to its location, only a few miles away from the Russian border. Russian forces have targeted towns, villages and settlements like this one, hoping to extend their control over the border areas and build up a buffer zone from which they can push on and potentially make further and more important territorial gains deeper into Ukraine. In the early days of June, Putin got what he wanted. Pravda.ua was one of several sources to confirm on June 4 that Andriyivka had fallen under Russian occupation. "The enemy has occupied Andriyivka and Vodolahi," said a message on the Deep State Telegram channel. Several other settlements in the area were similarly taken over, with Russia launching wave after wave of assault groups, often featuring a mixture of motorcycles and all-terrain vehicles, to take over as much territory as they could. They targeted numerous small settlements, some of which have only a handful of people living in them, and made easy gains. But Ukraine's armed forces weren't going to simply sit idly by and watch Russia take piece after piece of their territory. About 10 days after Andriyivka was captured, Ukraine managed to liberate it. The 225th Separate Assault Regiment led the charge, retaking Andriyivka on June 14 to put an end to the Russian advance in that area and regain some level of strategic control near the border. The counterattack was swift and tactical, a clear sign that Ukraine's forces are more than capable of going toe-to-toe with the Russians, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky celebrated the work of the 225th in his daily statement of June 14. There was a report by Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi on the front on our active actions. Special and very significant attention was paid to the Pokrovsky direction and our Sumy region, the border areas of our Sumy region. We're managing to knock out the Russian troops from there. I thank all our units for this, which really provide results. Following these days, our special gratitude goes to the soldiers of the 225th Separate Assault Regiment, precisely for the offensive operations in the border region of Sumy region and the liberation, in particular, of Andriyivka. Thank you guys very much. Now, the incredible efforts of the 225th Regiment cannot be understated. The regiment's story began in the early days of the war, on March 8, 2022 to be precise, when the 225th Separate Assault Battalion was created. Originally operating out of the Kharkiv Oblast, the battalion was later repositioned to various areas around Ukraine. It was involved in the bloody battles for Andriyivka in early 2024, for example, and also played a part in Ukraine's 2024 summer Kursk offensive, expanding into a regiment in February of this year. Around that same time, Ukraine's Kursk offensive began to wind down, with Russian forces retaking much of the land that the Ukrainians had managed to capture. It's likely that the 225th was either forced out of the area and into Sumy around that time, or was simply strategically repositioned there, allowing it to take decisive action in Andriyivka and reclaim the village for Ukraine. "We are leveling the position," said Zelensky on June 14. "The fighting there is along the border. You should understand that the enemy has been stopped there, and the maximum depth at which the fighting takes place is 7 kilometers, 4 miles from the border." The fighting that Zelensky speaks of is said to be particularly intense at the moment, as Russia has amassed a sizable force in the Sumy area and stepped up attacks in the area over recent weeks. In late May, the Ukrainian president sounded the alarm, claiming that more than 50,000 Russian troops were gathering at the border to the Sumy Oblast, with around 56,000 Ukrainian civilians evacuated from the region for their safety. Since then, Russia has launched multiple attacks into the area, and by mid-June, reports from outlets like the New York Times revealed that it had captured at least a dozen villages. But one village at a time, Ukraine is taking them back, showing the grit and determination that have become synonymous with its armed forces and its people on the whole. In his June 20 statement, President Zelensky hailed the work of his troops in the Sumy area. Also today, there was a meeting of the staff, a very detailed report on the front line. Particular attention was paid to the Sumy region, to operations in the border areas. I am grateful to our units for their resilience. The Russians had various plans and intentions there, absolutely insane as usual. We are holding them back and eliminating these killers, defending our Sumy region. Andriyivka is one of the key locations Ukraine is eager to defend, and on June 22, total liberation of the village was achieved. Reports suggest that some Russian forces remained in the area after the 225th made their initial movement into the village on June 14. But in the week that has passed since then, the remaining Russian troops have been either killed or ousted after some lengthy periods of combat. A Telegram post on the Deep State channel explained, "The defense forces of Ukraine liberated Andriyivka in Sumy region and managed to stabilize their left flank. The 225th Separate Assault Regiment, after prolonged fighting and clearing the village of Russian troops, managed to take control of the area. These actions succeeded in, first, diverting forces from other villages as the enemy had dug in at Andriyivka, and the second, stopping further advancement toward the important settlements of Khotin and Piskarivka. The 225th Infantry Division remains one of the few units capable of carrying out successful offensive operations. At the same time, those who understand the realities on the ground know that the 225th suffers significantly fewer casualties." As the post notes, there are two big benefits for Ukraine from the complete liberation of Andriyivka. First, it helped to weaken Russia's position in area neighbouring towns and settlements in Sumy, as the Russians attempted to dig in and fortify their position in Andriyivka. That means that those other villages are less heavily defended now and may be easier for Ukraine's forces to recapture when the time comes. And second, by regaining control of Andriyivka, Ukraine has effectively undone weeks of work for the Russians, pushing Putin's plans back further. They won't be able to use Andriyivka as a kind of springboard for future offensives deeper into Sumy territory, targeting locations like Khotin and Pisarivka. Instead, if they want to make those kinds of gains, the Russians will once again more have to retake Andriyivka. In short, Putin is right back to square one, only with a number of additional casualties for his army to deal with. And even if he orders another offensive on Andriyivka, this time Ukraine will be ready for it. The Deep State Telegram post goes on to explain that the 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade has been deployed to the village to help fortify and defend the area. So, even if a wave of Russian ATVs and motorcycle troops launches an attack, Ukrainian defenders will be waiting to greet them. There's also a third benefit from Ukraine recapturing Andriyivka, and perhaps it's the most important one of all. It allows Ukraine's armed forces to now push on and focus on recapturing their next target, pushing the Russians back even further. That next target is Yunakivka. Like Andriyivka, Yunakivka is situated in the Sumy region, with the two villages only around 9 miles apart, as the crow flies. And just like Andriyivka, Yunakivka is a small place without a large population or much significant infrastructure. Outside of the war, it's the kind of place that wouldn't hold any real significance except for those who call it home. But in this time of war, places like Yunakivka become so much more important because of their strategic locations and the opportunities they provide for whichever side has control of them. Yunakivka is only 4 miles away from the Russian border. Because of this, the village has seen its share of action since the invasion began. Indeed, as far back as February 2022, when the war was only just beginning, reports emerge of convoys of Russian military vehicles travelling through the village. They were heading for the city of Sumy, where a large battle took place on February 24, 2022, the first day of the invasion. The village has also come under repeated mortar and artillery attacks as Russian forces attempt to cross over the border and make gains of Ukrainian land, taking over towns and villages through brute force. Several civilians were killed in these attacks. Yet, in a remarkable display of courage and resilience, most of the residents originally refused to leave their homes. Even when a Russian bomb blew up the village's kindergarten, a large number of locals decided to stay exactly where they were. Many local children began studying remotely for their own safety, and villagers rapidly constructed an underground shelter. They fled and hid out in that shelter, sometimes several times per day, while continuing to lead their lives as well as they could. Since then, unfortunately for the locals, the situation has deteriorated. The village is one of many in the area to have fallen under Russian control. But the days of Russians in Yunakivka might be numbered. Oleksandr Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, recently highlighted Yunakivka as an important location for Ukraine to take in a press meeting, attended by reporters from various Ukrainian news outlets like Military. During that briefing, Syrskyi revealed that Ukrainian units had successfully advanced anywhere from 200 to 700 meters in different areas along the front lines, pushing the Russians back out of the contested area and decreasing the size of the Russian buffer zone that Putin is so desperate to maintain and expand. Syrskyi also revealed that Russia is actively attacking various positions in and around Yunakivka, as well as around Andriyivka and the nearby settlement of Oleksandr too. Fortunately, the commander confirmed that Ukraine's forces have not only regained control of Andriyivka, but have also largely stabilized the situation along the Kindrativka-Yunakivka line. Maps of the area, regularly updated on the Deep State website to show areas of Russian attack and occupation, as well as Ukrainian liberation, reveal just how intense the combat is in this particular region. Russia still has control of a relatively sizable area north of Sumy and is attempting to push south at multiple points along the front lines towards places like Kotin and Pisarivka. A large part of the Yunakivka area, meanwhile, sits in the so-called grey zone, an area of active combat and contested control where neither side has fully been able to assert itself as the dominant force at the moment. Ukraine is hoping to change all that and is soon set to launch a serious assault on the area to reclaim Yunakivka in its entirety. Syrskyi also confirmed that Brigadier General Oleh Apostol has taken charge of the troops in the Sumy area. Apostol was recently named commander of Ukraine's airborne assault forces and is said to be leading quite successfully, in Syrskyi's words. Aged 38, he graduated from a Ukrainian Army Academy in 2008, specializing in combat management of air mobile units. Since 2014, he had participated in various combat operations in eastern Ukraine, and since the Russian full-scale invasion began, he's proven a highly valuable member of the Ukrainian Armed Forces leadership group. He actively helped defend the Mykolaiv region and led various units in places around Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Luhansk. He's been awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine for his services, as well as the Order of the Golden Star, and assumed his new position on June 3rd of this year. Hopes are high that, under Apostol's command and with units like the 225th leading the way, Ukraine can make valuable gains and recaptures in Sumy. But it won't be easy. There's no doubt about it, Putin wants this area. That's been clear since day one of this war, when Russia sent troops and tanks and armoured vehicles straight into Sumy city, beginning a bloody battle in which the Ukrainian forces and civilian volunteers defended their land admirably, taking the Russians by surprise with their resilience and determination. It even reached a point where Russia decided to withdraw forces from the city and attempt alternative routes around it, in the hope of reaching Kyiv and claiming victory over Ukraine. That was a mistake. Various small groups of civilian fighters and Ukrainian soldiers launched multiple ambush attacks against Russian forces in the area, successfully pushing them back and maintaining control over Sumy. They've held the oblast ever since then, Even as Russia has made gains in other important areas, Sumy has remained almost entirely in Ukrainian hands. That's incredibly important for several key reasons. Firstly, the defense of Sumy helped stop the Russians from rapidly advancing on Kyiv in the early stages of the war. It completely obliterated Putin's hopes for a quick and easy victory, and it sent a clear message to Russia and the rest of the world that Ukraine was both willing and able to defend itself. That in turn is partly what helped Ukraine receive so much aid from various allies across the globe, such as the US. Global leaders saw that Ukraine wasn't going down without a fight, despite being a much smaller nation than Russia with a significantly smaller military. So they decided to send weapons, vehicles, missiles and more to help Ukraine fight. If Sumy had simply fallen in a matter of days and Russians had gone on to capture Kyiv, Western allies likely wouldn't have had the time, opportunity or inclination to support Ukraine as much as they have. They might have deemed it pointless to even send any weapons at all if it appeared that Russia was likely to win the war in a matter of days. The successful holding of Sumy has also consistently helped to give hope and inspiration to the people and soldiers of Ukraine, and that's been so crucial for the country over the last few years. Constantly facing difficult, seemingly insurmountable odds, Ukrainians have pulled off one miracle after another to keep their hopes of victory alive. What's more, the fact that Sumy has remained under Ukrainian control provided invaluable for the country's Kursk offensive of last year, in which Ukrainian squads and vehicles were able to cross over the Russian border from Sumy into Kursk, taking over various Russian towns and villages in the process. None of that would have been possible if Russia had successfully set up its Sumy buffer zone. Now, Ukraine faces perhaps the biggest challenge in this area yet, with Russia redoubling its efforts and doing all it can to make gains in Sumy. Multiple military experts are concerned about intense fighting in areas like Yunakivka, Yablonivka and Novomykolakivka, where Russian troops are amassing and attempting to fortify key positions before pushing deeper into the oblast. Deep state analysts say, particular attention should be paid to the area around Lochnia, where Russian forces are trying to advance east of the village and entrench themselves in the forested terrain towards Sadki. If they manage to hold that ground, dislodging them could prove extremely difficult. In other words, Ukraine cannot afford to slip up in these coming days and weeks. It must be ruthless, swift and efficient in its operations, and it will need to overcome difficult odds yet again in order to emerge on the right side of this battle. Taking Andriyivka was the first step in the fight. Taking Yunakivka would be just as important. It's vital that Ukraine's forces succeed, as every little victory here adds up, and they all help to delay the Russian push. The longer the war goes on without Russia achieving the total victory it wants, the more pressure will build on Putin, and the more likely he may be to take a seat at the negotiating table once more and agree to end this bloody conflict at long last. Now, learn more about Ukraine's liberation of Andriyivka in our detailed video breakdown, or find out how Ukraine's latest domestically made missiles are set to change the course of the war. And don't forget to subscribe to our trusted channel too for day-by-day updates on the war and other important geopolitical events across the globe.